What's going on, y'all? Joseph DiPietro here with lesson 4 of your 10-minute leadership talks. Today's lesson is going to be on counseling. Now, there's actually going to be a sub-lesson in there about demographic leadership, but they kind of tie together, and both classes would have been a little bit short, so I wanted to put them both in so we hit that 10-minute-ish mark. Counseling is one of the less sexy, less appealing aspects of leadership, but is also one of the most important. I myself will be the first to admit that early on in my Marine Corps career, I really struggled with counseling. Not the idea of counseling or not doing the counseling is actually one of the best parts, in my opinion, of being that leader, is getting that FaceTime, one-to-one conversation with that individual. The problem that I had with counseling was the administrative aspect of it. So making sure that we were keeping records and having everything available whenever you needed for boards, for promotions, for things like that. So we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but it's definitely a lot that I've learned with regard to counseling that I want to share with everybody. So what counseling is, if you're kind of unaware, is sort of the getting to know your folks, getting to observe them, and then after you observe them, you're going to give them feedback. So it's a good way to provide feedback, to tell your individuals, tell your team members, tell your players, hey, this is what you're doing well, this is what you're not doing well, this is where we can improve, and this is how we're going to do it. And they can be negative, they can be positive, they can be neutral. There's a bunch of different ways that you can rope counseling into your role as a leader, and we're going to talk about some of those. So I'm going to go sort of sequentially here of the steps of counseling, and you're going to start off with initial counseling. Now, depending on the size of your group or your unit, you may or may not get to do an initial counseling with everybody on your team or in your organization. Since primarily I'm talking to probably platoon commanders or low-level leadership members, you're going to get that opportunity, and I highly recommend it. Just getting that one-on-one FaceTime with everybody is very important. But if you don't, make sure you have something that reaches everybody in your organization, whether it was one of those command guidances that we talked about in lesson 1 with expectations, or some sort of a document or a video or a paper that sort of outlines that initial expectation or initial guidance to your group. But under the assumption that you're going to be able to talk to everybody, we're going to go with that. So you're going to want to give that initial counseling to each one of your team members, to your individuals, about what their job is, what your relationship in that job is, what you expect from them. So this would be a really good time to lay out those expectations we talked about in lesson 1. So say, hey, every member of our organization is expected to do X, Y, and Z. And then from there you can kind of expand on what their role is. If they're in a unique position, you can say, hey, these are the description of the position that I have for you, and these are the expectations that I have while you're in that position. So this is what you're going to do in that initial counseling. Now, I have a bullet here for initial counseling. This is where that second kind of subtopic is going to lead to. And this is what I call demographic leadership. Now, I want to reiterate that in all of my videos, my opinions are of my own and does not necessarily reflect the Marine Corps or the United States of America. You might hear that and say, oh, this is about to get spicy. It's not. It's going to be very simple. But with regard to demographic leadership, when you're doing your initial counselings, this is a really good time to understand and kind of get to know where your individuals are coming from, get to know their background, learn what their upbringing was like, if they came from a lower income family, if they came from a high income family, if they had access to technology, if they had to really struggle to get through school, if they were an athlete, whatever it might be. Everyone's going to have a different background, and that initial counseling is going to come into play there. So where the demographic comes into that is obviously their demographics are going to have a huge impact on their upbringing and where they came from. But in general, you're also going to see a major impact based off of their generation. So what we're seeing a lot of now with the young folks that are coming into the military or coming into work organizations is that they're a part of that new generation. Some folks are calling it Generation Z. I've heard the term network generation, which I like a lot, and what that kind of refers to is that this generation is all the folks who did not know life before the internet, right? So I knew life a little bit before the internet, but all the folks that we're getting that are 18 to 22-year-olds that are entering the workforce, entering the military now, have not known life without the internet. They've always had smartphones, they've always had access to technology, and that's going to come into play when you're a leader, because it's going to impact how you disseminate information, how they get information. And this is a big reason why earlier on in my videos I talked about leaders being on the ground floor or the ground level with their people working, because they're going to see everything. There's no way to escape. There's no way to hide. You're going to be able to be very visible, and your leadership is going to be very transparent, or has to be transparent, because your individuals, your team members are the folks, your players that are working for you or working with you, they're going to see right through everything, and they're going to have access to all the information. So that's what I'm talking about with demographic leadership. There's a whole bunch of other aspects of demographic leadership, especially when you're in the military, right? So one of my big proponents is that there's a standard, and I don't care who you are, where you came from, what your gender, race, nationality, anything like that is, orientation, doesn't matter. If you meet the standard and you're living up to a moral code and you're meeting those expectations, doesn't matter to me, you got it, right? So there's obviously going to be issues out there. We're not a perfect society right now, unfortunately. There's still folks that are out there that think differently, but as far as production goes, to me, it's you either make it or you don't. You're either meeting the standard or not. So if you're out there and you're still of the opinion like, hey, I'm going to judge someone differently because of the color of their skin, then I don't really want you to be a part of my team anyway. So if that's the case for you, then you probably want to turn off the video and stop watching, because not really for you. All right, so that's what demographic leadership means, and bringing that back to initial counseling, that's when you're going to find out a lot of that information about that individual. You're going to see how they interact with you on a personal level, because a lot of folks in that newer generation are having a little bit harder time connecting one-to-one, because all the connections that they made are through the internet or through technology or through video games. So there's going to be a big kind of learning curve for growing leaders and older leaders with regard to that technology and that personal interaction. So that's what the initial counseling is for. Some other keys for initial counseling is make sure that you clearly lay out what is going on with that job, with your expectation for that individual, because later on, when we talk about the scheduled counselings and stuff, if in your initial counseling you're clear and you say, hey, these are the things I expect of you, then later on you can say, you didn't meet this, or you did meet this, and then you can reward them or punish them accordingly. So initial counselings are huge. Make them count. Use them for a bunch of different ways, but definitely making sure that you lay out your expectations for that individual, that team member, that player moving forward as a part of your team. So then after you give your initial, you're going to have your scheduled counseling. So what I've seen work really well is sort of the lower levels may do those counselings more often. So if you have that kind of entry-level worker, entry-level teammate, or those junior Marines or soldiers, give them those counselings on the weekly to monthly basis. That way you're observing them and making an effort to observe them as much as possible. I will not say that you have to do those scheduled counselings all yourself as the leader. You might want to delegate that to some of your sort of section leaders or some of your crew leaders or whatever it might be, whatever organization you're in. Maybe they can do those counselings, and that'll give them some ownership and some leadership responsibility too. So I highly recommend that. But every now and then you might want to give them your own scheduled counseling, and or maybe just sit in on it and see how it's going and throw your 2 cents in there, or talk to that other person, that other leader that's giving the counseling, and throw a little nugget in there at the end. That's a recommendation. Find your own leadership style and what you want to do with it, but that's worked pretty well. So those scheduled counselings are a really good time to say, hey, this is what I tasked with you in the initial counseling, and this is where you're at with it. You've done really well, continue doing this, or you're struggling here, you're slacking here, we're going to get better at this. But if you're going to say or recommend that you get better at something, if one of your teammates is slacking or not doing what they need to do, make sure that you have a plan to increase that. It's not good enough to just say, hey, you're struggling here, I want you to get better at it. You should say something like, I see that you're deficient in public speaking, I want you to give a class to your 6 Marines, or I want you to give a class to your 3 subdivision team members every week, and that'll increase their public speaking capabilities. So make sure you lay out that goal for them in those scheduled counselings. You're going to have that initial counseling as well, but the scheduled counselings where you can get a little bit more specific, because now you're basing it off of actual observations. So those are what the scheduled counselings are going to be good for, making sure that the teammate is up to date and knows how they're doing. You never want to blindside them with either poor or positive performance. So if they're doing really well, another high recommendation of mine is that you continue to praise them. You can decide to do it in public or private, depending on the situation, but if they know that they're doing well, especially with that newer generation, they're going to continue doing well. If they know that they're having a good impact on the team, they're going to want to continue working for each other, and that's going to go a long way. So make sure we get those scheduled positive impacts out there, as well as the negative ones too, to make sure that they're getting better for the team. All right, and then the other kind of counseling I'm going to call is an impact counseling. Now, I just chose the word impact because in the Marine Corps, at least, we have impact awards, and that's sort of if they do something spectacular or significant in one instance. And so your counselings can can not only be scheduled or every 3 to 6 months. Let's just say you observe a member of yours or someone in your organization who did something really well or did something pretty poor that went against your team goals or team expectations. That impact counseling is going to be a good way to say, hey, on this date at this time, I observed you doing X and it was outstanding and we want to recognize you for that. Or on this date at this time, we observed you doing Y and it was not upholding the standards of our company or of our organization, and that's unacceptable. And here's what we want you to do to fix it. So those are good ways to say, hey, you're doing something well, you're doing something poor, and making sure that individual knows that he is doing something well or poor, and then they can either continue to do it, spread that information, or they can figure out a way to correct that deficiency. So those are going to be your impact awards, or your impact counselings, just to let them know that, hey, you did something well. All right, demographic leadership, we talked about that a little bit. Again, want to reiterate that initial counseling is a really good time to understand that individual or understand that soldier or Marine, whoever it is that you're talking to. When I do my initial counselings, I like to get pretty deep with my individuals. Now, again, it's going to depend on the size or how many folks that you have, but I like to get to know as much about them as possible. I want to know about their family. I want to know about their hobbies. That way, number one, I can connect to them on those levels. So if we share an interest or if we share a hobby, then we can connect on that level. If I understand about their family and their lifestyle, then I might know what they like to do in their free time or how they like to balance their work and their life timing. So really good time to understand that demographic leadership and get to know where your folks are coming from. So and the last thing I just want to mention is I mentioned the network generation phrase earlier. A couple years ago, I sat in on a seminar that was really kind of mind-altering with regard to generational leadership. And the seminar was led by this individual, Casey Reed. She is a professional sort of genealogist and generational analyst. And she wrote an article called How the Network Generation is Changing the Millennial Military. And it was all about kind of stuff we just talked about with regard to technology, with regard to attitudes, from generation to generation. It was an outstanding article, and just because it has a military background, I think it's a beneficial article for anybody in any sort of a leadership role who's working with that upcoming generation. So highly recommend that article. You can learn a lot from that. And Casey Reed is going to be the author of that, so all credit to her. It was an awesome article. All right, so that's going to do it for counseling today. Appreciate you guys tuning in. This is a really good way to take care of our individuals, right? We talked about working for our folks and not the other way around. This is a really good way we work for them. Those counselings are going to come in a huge play when folks are getting put up for boards, for promotions, when they're, or negative side. So if you want to keep someone from getting an award or a promotion, and you have that negative counseling, it's sort of a really good record to say, hey, this individual is really not performing to the standard that I expect, so maybe they shouldn't get promoted or recognized or whatever it might be. I'll say that's when I really sort of took one in the face there with regard to counseling. Is one of my Marines was getting promoted who I really didn't feel should have been promoted. And when I said, hey, I don't recommend this Marine for promotion, they asked me for my records. And I said, well, I don't really have anything written down, but I've talked to him a bunch and he doesn't deserve to be promoted. Well, talking to them, there's no record of it and it didn't really hold up on the board. So sure enough, that Marine got promoted and was given greater responsibility. So that was on me as a leader for not taking care of them. So that's a really good way to take care of our folks, is to make sure that we note those positive and negative parts of their work and whatever they get from there. So thank you very much for your time and have a great day.